Welcome back to Sputnik. When I was a kid, gambling was so illegal in this country that not a single bookmaker shop, let alone casino, existed in the land. People who wanted to place wagers on horse races did so with a criminal bookie, and his bookie's runner standing on the street corner was regularly subject to arrest. One of the mysteries of this age is how Britain became transformed into a gambler's paradise, and under the prime ministership of a Labour government led at the end by a figure, Gordon Brown, whose father was a Church of Scotland minister and who was otherwise bowed down by the burdens of Presbyterian rectitude.
Now you can't move for bookies and a televised advertisement. You can even lose your house while sitting in it playing online roulette. The small print, gamblers should behave responsibly, not worth the paper it isn't written on.
Joining us now to discuss how and why it happened and take a flutter on where we're headed is Professor Jim Orford of the University of Birmingham. But first, Gayatri, red gloves and all, asked the London public what they thought.
Gambling, don't know. Seems like everything, just exploiting people, getting their money sort of thing. Unfair odds, like you're never really going to win. Like, yeah, just another transfer of money into the hands of wealthy people.
I think it's out of control for some people. I think it becomes addictive and is a big problem.
It depends if you class something like playing the lottery as gambling as well, I guess, which is a bit more different, which I would agree with. But I think these online casinos and things, it sounds like they can cause a lot of problems.
Apps on phones and everything is too easy, and it doesn't seem like real money. I know one or two people who've been involved in online casinos and that, and starts off very well, and then all of a sudden they take a hit and lose a load of money. So
I think there's an unhealthy amount of advertising about gambling on the television. I find it actually overwhelming, and I'm not someone who ever does gamble. I'm a neuroscientist, and I understand the power of addiction, and I think that the pushing that you see on television all of the time in peak hours of adult viewing is just too much.
Professor, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Let's start with that $64,000 question. How did this happen? Why did this happen?
Well, it's a long story. I remember that time as well. That was how it was when I was growing up.
The bookie's runner, yeah. Young
Exactly.
people now don't know what a bookie's runner is.
Oh, well, exactly. And then it changed in the 1960s because that was when bookmakers' shops became legal. And there was a period between the 1960s and probably when the National Lottery started was actually much more significant than people realised, because it opened the floodgates of other sorts of gambling as well. But in that period between the 60s and the beginning of the 1990s was a period when gambling was tolerated and bookies were made legal, but it wasn't encouraged. That was the crucial thing.
You weren't allowed to advertise it.
You weren't allowed to advertise it, and there was a very significant thing called the demand test. So that if you in your area you already had a bookmaker's shop, and someone else wanted to start another one. So if Ladbrokes already had one and Paddy Power wanted to start another one, they had to demonstrate to the council that there was unmet need. Well, now, that all changed with the 2005 Gambling Act, and this was the one that New Labour brought in. And really, looking back, New Labour, I mean, there are now Labour MPs who were around at the time who apologised for this. I mean, they realised that they were very uncaring about what would happen to gambling and society and how this would put people at risk because of gambling problems. But basically what they said is gambling is now to be considered as an ordinary commodity. It's just like any other entertainment for which you pay. It's good business. It's good business for Britain. So one of the things they said was internet gambling, should we legalise internet gambling? Of course we should. And I think that's had extraordinary effects. I mean, the things that people realise have happened as a result is all the advertising. And everybody I talk to says, you know, we're fed up with being bombarded with advertising. I mean, I think what's happened is essentially two things. One is that the 2005 Act gave a green light to the industry to innovate. And by goodness, haven't they innovated? So, and I think the two particular things that have totally changed gambling. I mean, gambling in those days that you were talking about, the bookies runner, it was principally betting on horses, and there was dog racing in the stadia as well, and some football pools and so on. But what's happened now is two particular forms of gambling dominate now. One is internet gambling, which actually is still a minority pursuit, but it's rising very, very rapidly. And the other thing that I think most people aren't aware of, unless you're particularly interested, is the innovations, technological innovations in gambling machines. So you remember the gambling machines, the one
one-armed bandit.
Yes, we can all do that. The one-armed bandit. It's not like that now. Blimey, they're sophisticated now.
These are now 24 hours available on motorway service stations.
Yes, motorway service stations.
So we would run there at 11
Yes.
o'clock. The restaurant is closed, but you can go into
You
this
can still
gambling hall.
gamble.
Yes,
I want to
absolutely,
pick up this 2005 Gambling Act. I was there. I opposed it.
Yes, good.
The Labour Party, of which I was for 36 years a member, founded more on Methodism than Marxism, with a strong moral code and so on. Isn't it an irony? Isn't it perhaps the biggest apostasy of them all that a Labour government turned Britain into a gambling free-for-all?
Yes, well, I think it is. And one of the things that's clearly happened in recent years is that because the forms of gambling have changed, horse racing is still there, but now the internet and also the machines, there are these very, very dangerous new machines in bookies. I don't know if you realise, but now they're about 10 years or so ago, they invented these machines. They're called fixed odds betting terminals,
Yes.
and you will have come across
Yes.
this because the government's been under a lot of pressure to do something about these. They slipped in. The industry said these aren't really gambling machines. They're completely different because you can play roulette on them. It's not like lining up three lemons or cherries. It's about playing roulette and blackjack and so on. Therefore, they're not gambling machines. Therefore, the maximum of £2, which used to be £1, it's just recently gone up £2. The maximum of £2 shouldn't apply. And you should be allowed to bet £100 at a time. And we've got these machines in the bookmakers' shops now. They're causing an enormous amount of trouble. All the evidence from surveys and so on is that they're appealing particularly to poorer people, unemployed people particularly. They cluster in poorer areas. The local authorities can't do anything about it because of this demand test. So if they say, look, we've got 3 bookies already, we don't want a 4th, and a 4th comes along and wants a license.
He can appeal and win.
They can't. They can't do anything about it.
No, I opposed, one of the few to do so. I opposed the introduction of a national lottery.
Yes.
In fact, on several of the clauses, there was only me and the late Reverend Ian Paisley in the lobby, and he said to me, "Fancy me and a wee pape like you being the only 2 members of the House to stand up against the devil's buttermilk." That's how the tide was.
Yes.
The tide was for gambling, more gambling.
Yes.
And of course, then there was the scratch card, which I described as the crack cocaine of the national lottery business. The poorest people spending the most money on the desperate hope of coming up trumps with these cards. It's grown and grown and grown. Would it be fair to say that there's no going back?
Well, I think there are two views, and I kind of veer between one and the other. I mean, one is, yes, it's very difficult. Once so many people are dependent on finances from the gambling industry, and once the government have gone down that way, every time they try and draw back from things. For example, if they wanted to, there's a very good campaign called the Fairer Gambling Campaign, who've been arguing and making a lot of noise. Let's reduce this maximum of £100 down to the £2, which is normal for other machines. The government have said, yes, we should do something about it, but they've dragged their feet over it. They've said, oh, we've got a bit of research project here. Let's wait until we get the results. The research happens to be financed by the gambling industry, which is another thing. Don't get me started on that and go about that for a while. And so then once you've got things, it's very difficult, I think, to pull back from. On the other hand, I sometimes veer towards the other point of view, and you've talked to the people in the street about this, and in the national surveys, a number of attitude questions were included, and it is surprising that actually most British people are much more inclined towards a policy which is like that period between the 60s and the 90s. Let's tolerate it. We don't want to ban it. We don't want to prohibit it altogether. But let's be very careful about it. Let's regulate it very carefully. Let's encourage it.
Yeah,
Well,
because they
look,
acknowledge.
Professor, you cannot advertise cigarettes on television, in newspapers, on buses. You cannot now, soon, even buy a cigarette packet with a logo on it, plain paper wrapping. How can it be that gambling, which is actually far more damaging to more people than smoking is everywhere around us, on every television station, all night, and every other medium possible? Surely we can get a campaign up that seeks to restrict the amount of advertising of this devil's buttermilk.
Yes, I agree. And the costs are very, very considerable. But we think the evidence, the epidemiological evidence, is that amongst adults, and that's not counting adolescents who are particularly vulnerable, but amongst adults, we think there's something between 250,000 people who actually have a gambling disorder in Britain, and that's very similar to the number of people who've got illicit drug-related problems, which is a big surprise.
It's the tip of an iceberg. It's like measuring the alcohol problem by the number of people who go to AA meetings.
Yes,
there are millions more.
Absolutely, and families. It's devastating families and for communities and so on. But
Professor, we need to leave it there. Alas. But it's a fascinating subject, and we'll see if we can find a way.
I was going to say there are campaigns. Gambling Watch UK is my website.
Gambling Watch UK?
Gambling Watch UK, which I really set up in order to try and get people to debate these issues, because it's a bit under the radar for a lot of people.
Stories.
Yeah. That's
why we wanted you here on the Sputnik today.
Yes.
Gambling Watch UK.
Yep.
I'll look it up now, right after the show. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So gambling, is it harmless entertainment or dangerously destructive? And as on the street, the responses online were the same. Steve Brindle says, capitalism has no moral boundaries. Corporations daily break civilized mores. And Akib Mahmoud says, fact always, remember what goes up must come down. The pumping is done, the dumping is to come. And Jack Beckett says, for those making millions, I'm sure call it harmless entertainment. But for those left picking up the pieces, it's dangerously destructive.
Well, as Marx said, with capitalism, all that is sacred will be profaned. All that is solid will melt into air.
And that's it for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik and on Facebook on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.